The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Appalachian Studies Archive at East Tennessee State University, casting long shadows across the rows of document boxes and photograph collections that filled the climate-controlled storage room. Dr. Michael Chen, a 35-year-old historian specializing in labor movements in rural America, carefully lifted a manila folder from a recently acquired collection, his gloved hands treating the contents with the reverence they deserved. The archive had just received a donation from the estate of Reverend Thomas Blackwood, a retired minister whose family had served coal mining communities in eastern Kentucky for 4 generations. Among the boxes of sermons and church records were dozens of historical photographs, visual documentation of religious life in the mountains during the early 20th century. Michael had been cataloging the collection for 2 weeks, a methodical process that required photographing each item, creating detailed metadata, and assessing the historical significance of every document and image. Most of the photographs were standard for the period: formal portraits of church congregations, images of revival meetings, pictures of church buildings in various states of construction or repair. But this particular photograph, mounted on heavy cardboard backing with a photographer's embossed stamp in the corner, immediately caught his attention when he removed it from its protective sleeve. The image showed the interior of a small wooden church, probably a Methodist or Baptist congregation based on the simple architecture and lack of elaborate decoration. Roughly 40 people were arranged in neat rows facing the camera, men on one side and women on the other, as was customary in many Appalachian churches of that era. They were dressed in their Sunday finest, though the clothes showed the wear and careful mending common to working-class families. The lighting was natural, streaming through windows on the left side of the frame, creating a sense of warmth and community despite the formal poses required by the long exposure times of early 20th century photography. What made the photograph remarkable was its exceptional clarity and composition. The photographer, whose stamp identified him as James Morrison of Harlan County, Kentucky, had positioned his camera to capture not just the faces of the congregation but also the details of the church interior. Michael could see the rough-hewn wooden pews, the simple altar with its white cloth covering, the oil lamps hanging from the ceiling, even the individual pages of the hymn books that several people held open in their laps. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, was a date and location: Mount Zion Methodist Church, Lynch, Kentucky, April 22, 1906. Michael set up his copy stand and began the process of creating a high-resolution digital scan of the photograph. This was standard procedure for all items entering the archive, creating a preservation master that could be used for research without risking damage to the original. As the scanner's light bar moved slowly across the image, capturing every detail at 1200 dots per inch, Michael thought about the historical context of this particular time and place. Lynch, Kentucky, in 1906 was a coal mining town in its earliest stages of development. The area had been sparsely populated until the arrival of the railroad and the subsequent boom in coal extraction that would transform eastern Kentucky over the following decades. The communities that formed around the mines were diverse, bringing together native Appalachian families, African American migrants from the Deep South, and European immigrants seeking work in the expanding industrial economy. Churches served as vital centers of community life, providing not just spiritual guidance but also social services, education, and a sense of stability in the often chaotic boomtown environment. The digital scan completed, and Michael opened the file on his workstation, using professional image viewing software that allowed him to zoom in on specific sections of the photograph with extraordinary magnification. He began his standard documentation process, noting the number of people in the image, attempting to estimate their ages and relationships, observing details of clothing and posture that might provide insights into the social dynamics of the congregation. Then he zoomed in on the hymn books, and everything changed. Several people in the front row held hymn books open on their laps, the pages clearly visible in the high-resolution scan. Michael had examined hundreds of similar photographs during his career, and hymn books were common props in church portraits of this era. Usually, the pages were too far from the camera or at angles that made the text illegible. But Morrison had positioned his camera with unusual precision, and the natural light from the windows illuminated the pages held by a woman sitting in the front row, third from the left. Michael zoomed in further, his heart rate increasing as the text on the hymn book pages became readable. What he saw made him catch his breath and immediately call his colleague, Dr. Patricia Hammond, who worked in the office next door. The hymn book pages were covered with handwritten text, but it wasn't music or lyrics. Instead, cramped in the margins and between the printed lines of hymns, someone had written what appeared to be names, dates, and short phrases. Michael could make out individual words: reading, writing, graduated, and what looked like a list of names with check marks beside them. The writing was small and careful, filling every available space on the visible pages, transforming the hymn book into something else entirely, a record or ledger of some kind. "Patricia, you need to see this," Michael said when his colleague appeared in the doorway. Patricia was 48, a specialist in Appalachian women's history with a particular focus on education and literacy movements. She had silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and the sharp, analytical gaze of someone who had spent decades interrogating historical sources for hidden meanings. Michael showed her the magnified section of the photograph, and Patricia leaned in close to the screen, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she studied the handwritten text. After a long moment of silence, she straightened up and looked at Michael with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Do you know what you've found?" she asked, her voice tight with the kind of controlled enthusiasm that comes from years of academic training. "This is evidence of a literacy school. Look at the structure of the list, the names with marks beside them. Someone was keeping records of students, probably adults learning to read and write. And they were hiding those records in a hymn book, which means the school itself was probably secret or at least unofficial." Michael felt the familiar thrill of discovery that made historical research so compelling despite its often tedious nature. "Secret literacy schools in coal mining communities," he said slowly, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "I've read about those. The mining companies discouraged education because literate workers were more likely to organize unions, more able to understand contracts and challenge unfair practices. Teachers who tried to educate miners and their families sometimes faced threats or were run out of town." "Exactly," Patricia confirmed, pulling up a chair to sit beside Michael's workstation. "And churches were one of the few places where education could happen with some protection from company interference. Ministers could claim they were teaching Bible reading, which was socially acceptable, while actually providing broader literacy education. If this hymn book was being used to keep records of such a school, it's an incredibly rare artifact. Most evidence of these secret schools was deliberately destroyed or lost because the work was dangerous for everyone involved." They spent the next hour carefully examining every detail of the photograph, zooming in on different sections, looking for additional clues. Michael documented everything methodically, taking screenshots of significant details, making notes about what they observed. The woman holding the hymn book with the handwritten records appeared to be in her 30s, with a serious expression and intelligent eyes. She sat with perfect posture, the hymn book positioned carefully on her lap, angled just enough toward the camera that the pages were visible. Several other people in the photograph were also holding books, though the angles and distances made it impossible to determine if their books also contained hidden writing. "We need to identify these people," Patricia said, her historian's instinct immediately moving toward the next phase of research. "Church records, census data, mining company employment logs, anything that can help us put names to these faces and understand who they were, what their lives were like. If we can identify the woman holding the marked hymn book, we might be able to trace her story, understand how she came to be involved in a secret literacy school." "The photograph came from the Blackwood family collection," Michael said, pulling up the accession records on his computer. Reverend Thomas Blackwood's family served churches in this region for generations. His grandfather, also Thomas Blackwood, was a circuit rider minister in eastern Kentucky starting in the 1890s. There might be church records, diaries, correspondence that could help identify the congregation members. Patricia nodded enthusiastically. "I'll reach out to the family, see if there are additional materials that weren't included in the donation. You focus on the photograph itself, see if you can enhance the text enough to read more of what's written in that hymn book. We need to know what those names and notations mean, who these students were, what they were learning." Over the following week, Michael worked intensively with the photograph, using advanced image enhancement techniques to bring out details that were barely visible in the original scan. He adjusted contrast and brightness, applied filters designed to enhance faded text, painstakingly reconstructed letters and words from fragmentary evidence. It was slow, exacting work that required both technical skill and educated guesswork about what the original text might have said. Gradually, the contents of the hymn book pages became clearer. Michael could now read complete names. Sarah Willis, Reading Primer completed March 1906. John Thompson, Arithmetic and Writing, January 1906. Martha Owens, Bible Reading, February 1906. There were dozens of names, each with a notation about what they had studied and when they had completed their lessons. At the top of one page, in slightly larger writing, was a phrase that made Michael's breath catch. Knowledge is freedom. Teach in secret, learn in silence, remember in courage. This wasn't just a record of a literacy school. It was a manifesto, a statement of purpose that captured the dangerous and radical nature of what these people had been doing. Teaching adults to read in a coal mining community where the company wanted workers to remain dependent and controllable was an act of quiet rebellion, of resistance to systems designed to keep people powerless. And someone had documented it, had taken the risk of creating a written record, had made sure that their work would be remembered even if they had to hide that record in the margins of a hymn book. Patricia's research into the Blackwood family papers yielded equally significant results. She found a diary kept by Thomas Blackwood Sr., the circuit rider minister who had served the Lynch area in the early 1900s. His entries were brief and often cryptic, written in a personal shorthand that suggested he knew the diary might be read by unsympathetic eyes. But several entries from 1905 and 1906 made oblique references to evening lessons, and the learning circle, and those who seek wisdom despite obstacles. One entry, dated April 20, 1906, just 2 days before the photograph was taken, was particularly revealing. Much progress with our evening students. Martha has proven herself a gifted teacher, patient and clever in her methods. The company men grow suspicious, but we continue with caution. Sunday, we shall make a portrait to commemorate our community. I shall ensure the evidence of our work is preserved, though hidden in plain sight. Future generations must know what was done here, what courage it took to claim the right to learn. Martha, Patricia said, showing Michael the diary entry. The minister calls her a gifted teacher. Martha Owens is one of the names written in the hymn book. And look at the dates. The photograph was taken 2 days after this diary entry, and Blackwood specifically mentions preserving evidence while keeping it hidden. He was talking about this photograph, about making sure the hymn book with its handwritten records was visible in the image. Michael felt a profound sense of connection across time, the recognition that he was looking at a deliberate act of historical documentation, a minister and a teacher working together to ensure that their secret school would not be forgotten even if they had to hide the evidence in plain sight. The photograph wasn't just a standard church portrait. It was a carefully constructed historical artifact, designed to look innocent while actually preserving crucial information about a community's resistance to oppression. We need to find out more about Martha Owens, Michael said. She's the key to this whole story. The diary calls her the teacher. She's the one holding the hymn book in the photograph, positioned specifically so the written pages would be visible. Who is she? How did she come to be teaching in a secret school? What happened to her and to the other people in this photograph? Patricia pulled up census records on her laptop, beginning the painstaking process of tracing individuals through the fragmentary documentary evidence that survived from that era. Martha Owens, Kentucky, 1906, she murmured, typing search terms into the genealogical database. Let's see what we can find. The search would take days, even weeks, requiring them to cross-reference multiple sources to piece together fragments of information from census records, tax rolls, church membership lists, mining company employment records, and any other documents that might mention the people in the photograph. But both historians knew that the effort would be worthwhile. They had discovered something remarkable, evidence of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, risking their livelihoods and possibly their safety to claim the fundamental human right to education and literacy. As Michael saved his enhanced images and began preparing a preliminary report on the discovery, he thought about the phrase written at the top of the hymn book page, "Knowledge is freedom." In a coal mining community where power was concentrated in the hands of company owners, where workers were often kept in perpetual debt through company stores and company housing, literacy represented a genuine threat to the existing order. People who could read could understand their contracts, could communicate with labor organizers, could access ideas and information that might inspire them to demand better conditions. The secret school documented in this photograph was not just about education. It was about power, about ordinary people claiming agency in a system designed to keep them powerless. The census records proved frustrating at first. Martha Owens was a common name in early 20th century Kentucky, and the 1906 state census had been partially destroyed by fire in the 1920s, leaving gaps in the documentation. But Patricia was nothing if not persistent, and she had decades of experience tracking individuals through the labyrinth of historical records. She cross-referenced the Lynch area church membership lists with mining company employment records, looking for families that included a woman named Martha Owens in the right age range. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A researcher at the Kentucky Historical Society, responding to Patricia's inquiry on a professional email list, sent her a digitized copy of a letter collection that had recently been processed. The letters were correspondence between Margaret Townsend, a wealthy philanthropist from Lexington, and various teachers and social reformers working in eastern Kentucky coal communities during the early 1900s. Townsend had funded several educational initiatives aimed at improving conditions for mining families, and she had maintained extensive correspondence with the people doing the work on the ground. Among the letters was a series written by Martha Owens, starting in late 1904 and continuing through early 1907. The letters were remarkable documents, written in clear, educated prose that immediately established Martha as an intelligent and articulate observer of the world around her. Patricia printed out the entire collection and spent an entire afternoon reading through them, occasionally calling out significant passages to Michael, who was working on further enhancement of the photograph in the adjacent office. Martha's story emerged in fragments from the letters, pieces of a life that became clearer with each successive document. She had been born in 1873 in Wise County, Virginia, to a family of small farmers. Her father, unusually for the time and place, had believed strongly in education for both his sons and daughters, and Martha had attended school through the 8th grade, an impressive achievement for a rural mountain girl of that era. She had wanted to become a teacher, but family financial difficulties following her father's death had forced her to seek paid work instead. She had married at 19, moved to Kentucky with her husband, a coal miner named James Owens, and had borne 3 children in quick succession. Her letters were matter-of-fact about the hardships of life in the mining camps, the poverty and danger and isolation, but they also revealed her determination to create something better for her children and her community. When the youngest child started school, Martha had approached the local teacher, offering to assist with instruction in exchange for access to books and materials that she could use to continue her own education. "Listen to this," Patricia called to Michael, reading from a letter dated November 1904. Martha writes, "The need for education here is desperate beyond what comfortable people in cities can imagine. The company provides a school for the children, but it is overcrowded and poorly supplied, and the teacher is overwhelmed. But it is the adults who suffer most acutely from lack of learning. Many of the miners cannot read their own contracts, cannot check the company tallies of their coal production, cannot write letters to families left behind. They know they are being cheated, but they lack the tools to prove it or fight it. Several have asked me to teach them their letters, and I have agreed, though the work must be done in secret. The company does not want educated workers." Michael came to stand in Patricia's doorway, listening as she continued reading. Martha's letters painted a vivid picture of the secret school that had developed over the following months. She taught in the evenings, after the miners returned from their shifts, using the church building with the blessing and assistance of Reverend Blackwood. The students were mostly men at first, miners determined to learn to read and do arithmetic so they could verify the company's calculations of their wages. But gradually, women joined as well, mothers who wanted to be able to help their children with schoolwork, wives who wanted to write letters to distant relatives, women who simply yearned for the knowledge they had been denied. The work was dangerous. Mining companies in eastern Kentucky during this period maintained tight control over their workers' lives, and education was seen as a threat to that control. Company guards patrolled the camps at night, supposedly for security but actually to monitor and control the activities of the residents. The miners and their families lived in company-owned houses, shopped at company-owned stores, and could be evicted and blacklisted if they caused trouble. Teachers who tried to educate adult workers could find themselves run out of town or worse. Martha's letters described the precautions they took. Classes were disguised as prayer meetings or hymn practice. Students arrived and left at different times to avoid attracting attention. They used primers and textbooks that Reverend Blackwood obtained through his church connections, materials that could be hidden quickly if company guards came around. Martha kept no official attendance records, relying instead on the handwritten notations in the margins of her own hymn book, a record that looked innocent but actually documented every student's progress. She was risking everything, Michael said quietly, imagining the courage it must have taken to persist with this work despite the very real dangers. If the company had found out, they could have evicted her family, blacklisted her husband so he couldn't find work in any mine in the region. Why take that risk? Patricia looked up from the letters, her expression thoughtful. "Read this one," she said, handing Michael a letter dated March 1906, just a month before the photograph was taken. Martha explains her motivations. Michael read aloud, "Mrs. Townsend asks why I continue this work despite the risks, and I shall answer honestly. I teach because I remember what it felt like to be hungry for learning, to know that there was a whole world of knowledge and ideas beyond the narrow confines of my mountain valley, and to lack the tools to access that world. I teach because I have seen grown men weep with frustration when they try to sign their names and can only make an X. I teach because I know that knowledge is power, and these good people have so little power over their own lives. If I can give them the ability to read a contract, to write a letter, to do arithmetic well enough to check the company tallies, then I have given them a weapon to fight back against exploitation. And if I am caught and punished for this, then so be it. Some things are worth the risk." The room was quiet for a moment after Michael finished reading. Both historians understood that they were no longer dealing with an abstract historical curiosity but with real people who had made difficult and dangerous choices driven by principles and compassion. Martha Owens was not a name in a ledger or a face in a photograph. She was a woman who had seen injustice and had chosen to fight it in the way available to her through education and empowerment. "What happened to her?" Michael asked. "Do the letters continue past 1906? Can we trace what happened to her and her family to the school?" Patricia shuffled through the remaining letters, her expression growing somber. The last letter in this collection is dated April 1907, exactly 1 year after the photograph. Martha writes that the school has been discovered by the company. Several of the students were fired from their jobs and evicted from company housing. James, her husband, was demoted to less safe work in the mine, a clear retaliation. Reverend Blackwood was pressured by company executives to leave the area, though he refused. Martha says they have suspended the classes temporarily, hoping that the attention will die down and they can resume in a few months. But she sounds discouraged, worn down by the constant struggle and afraid for her family's safety. Michael felt a wave of disappointment and anger. So they shut her down. All that work, all that courage, and the company just crushed it. "Maybe not completely," Patricia said slowly, reaching for another document she had printed out earlier. "I found a reference in a 1910 United Mine Workers Organizing report. The union was trying to establish a local in the eastern Kentucky coal fields, and they mentioned that Lynch had an unusually high rate of literacy among its workers, which had made organizing easier. The report specifically noted that many miners could read union literature and write letters to family members encouraging them to support the organizing effort. The company eventually had to negotiate because the workers were too informed and too unified to be easily controlled." Michael thought about the names written in Martha's hymn book, the students who had learned to read and write in those secret evening classes. So the education did make a difference. Even after the school was shut down, the skills remained. The people Martha taught could use their literacy to organize, to fight back, to demand better conditions. Exactly, Patricia confirmed. And they would have passed that knowledge on to their children, creating a generational impact that went far beyond the immediate effect of the classes. This is why education has always been seen as threatening by oppressive systems. You can take away someone's job, their house, their possessions, but once they have knowledge and skills, those remain. They can't be confiscated. Over the next several weeks, Michael and Patricia worked to identify as many of the other people in the photograph as possible. Using a combination of census records, church membership lists, and mining company employment records, they were able to put names to approximately 30 of the 40 faces in the image. Each name led to another fragment of a story, another glimpse into the lives of the people who had gathered in Mount Zion Methodist Church on that April day in 1906. John Thompson, whose name appeared in Martha's hymn book as having completed arithmetic and writing lessons in January 1906, had gone on to become a union organizer, eventually serving as president of a United Mine Workers local chapter. Sarah Willis, noted as completing a reading primer in March, had opened a small lending library in her home, providing books to families throughout the mining camp. Several of the students had moved away from Lynch over the following years, using their literacy skills to find better opportunities in cities or on more productive farmland. Not all the stories ended well. James Owens, Martha's husband, had been killed in a mine accident in 1909, one of the many tragedies that plagued the dangerous coal extraction industry. Martha had moved to Lexington with her children shortly after, finding work as a seamstress and continuing her involvement with educational and labor reform causes until her death in 1934. But even the tragic stories revealed resilience and courage, people who had faced terrible circumstances and had still insisted on creating meaning and fighting for justice. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a sociologist at the University of Kentucky who specialized in labor history, reached out to Michael and Patricia after hearing about their discovery through academic networks. She had been researching secret education movements in industrial communities and was excited to learn about the Lynch photograph and the documentation it provided. "What you found is incredibly rare," Dr. Warren told them during a video conference call. "Most evidence of these secret schools was deliberately destroyed or lost. The teachers and students knew they were engaging in subversive activity, so they rarely created records that could be used against them. The fact that Martha Owens kept even a hidden record in her hymn book, and that Reverend Blackwood had the foresight to document it photographically, is extraordinary. This is primary source evidence of resistance to corporate oppression, of ordinary people claiming agency in a system designed to deny them power." Dr. Warren proposed a collaborative project, combining Michael and Patricia's archival findings with her sociological analysis to create a comprehensive study of labor, education, and resistance in early 20th century Appalachian coal communities. She also suggested that they try to locate descendants of the people in the photograph to see if family memories and oral histories had preserved any additional information about the secret school. The search for descendants began with genealogical databases and social media, modern tools that made it possible to trace family lines forward through the 20th century in ways that would have been impossible just a decade earlier. Michael created a project website, posting the photograph along with a detailed explanation of what they had discovered and a list of the names they had been able to identify. He included a contact form, inviting anyone who recognized family members or who had information about the Mount Zion Methodist Church community to reach out. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, Michael had received more than 50 emails from people who recognized ancestors in the photograph or who had family stories related to the Lynch coal mining community. Patricia helped him sort through the responses, identifying which ones provided genuinely new information and which were tangential or speculative. Several of the respondents were descendants of people whose names appeared in Martha's hymn book, and their family stories often included references to literacy and education, suggesting that the impact of the secret school had been remembered and valued across generations. The most significant contact came from Helen Thompson Martinez, a retired schoolteacher living in Asheville, North Carolina. Her great-grandfather was John Thompson, the man whose name appeared in the hymn book as having completed arithmetic and writing lessons. Helen had grown up hearing stories about her great-grandfather's dedication to education and his involvement in the labor movement, and she had boxes of family papers that she had been meaning to donate to an archive but had never gotten around to organizing. My great-grandfather always said that learning to read was the most important thing that ever happened to him, Helen wrote in her email. He talked about a woman teacher in the coal camp who taught evening classes in secret, though he never mentioned her name. He said she was brave and smart, and that she changed his life by giving him the tools to understand the world and fight for his rights. I have his journals and some letters that might have information relevant to your research. I would be happy to share them. Michael and Patricia drove to Asheville the following week, meeting Helen at her comfortable home in a neighborhood of tree-lined streets and well-kept older houses. Helen was in her 70s, a warm and energetic woman who clearly inherited her great-grandfather's value for education. She had been a teacher for 35 years, specializing in adult literacy programs, and she spoke passionately about the importance of education as a tool for social mobility and empowerment. She led them to her dining room, where she had spread out the contents of several archival boxes. There were photographs, letters, a worn leather-bound journal, newspaper clippings, and various documents related to John Thompson's involvement with the United Mine Workers. Michael and Patricia spent hours going through the materials, documenting everything, while Helen provided context and family stories. The journal was particularly valuable. John Thompson had started keeping it in 1906, shortly after completing his lessons with Martha Owens, and he had continued adding entries sporadically until his death in 1945. His early entries were written in a careful, labored hand that gradually became more fluid and confident as his writing skills improved. The journal documented his work in the mines, his growing involvement with union organizing, his family life, and his reflections on the social and economic conditions of coal mining communities. Several entries from 1906 described the secret school in detail. Thompson wrote about the challenge of learning to read as an adult, the frustration of struggling with letters and words that children seem to grasp easily, the embarrassment of making mistakes in front of other students. But he also wrote about the satisfaction of slowly mastering these new skills, the revelation of being able to read a newspaper or a union pamphlet, the sense of empowerment that came with literacy. One entry, dated April 25, 1906, just 3 days after the photograph was taken, provided crucial context. We made a portrait at the church on Sunday, all of us who have been part of Mrs. Owens's learning circle. Reverend Blackwood said it was important to document our community, to make a record that future generations would be able to see. Mrs. Owens held her hymn book, the one where she keeps our names and progress. She positioned it carefully, and Reverend Blackwood made sure the photographer captured it clearly. I asked her why, and she said that even if we must work in secret now, someday people should know what we did here, how we fought for knowledge despite the company's opposition. She said our story might inspire others facing similar struggles. Michael and Patricia exchanged glances, their suspicions about the photograph's intentional documentation confirmed by this contemporary account. The photograph had been deliberately staged to preserve evidence of the secret school, with both Martha and Reverend Blackwood understanding that they were creating a historical record that might not be understood for decades or even generations. Helen provided additional context from family stories. My great-grandfather always said that Mrs. Owens was the bravest person he ever knew, Helen explained. He said she risked everything to teach them, and that when the company tried to shut down the school, she wanted to keep going even though it meant her family might suffer. Eventually, Reverend Blackwood convinced her to stop temporarily, but my great-grandfather said she never really gave up on education. Even after she moved away, she continued to help people learn, working with churches and reform organizations in Lexington. Over the following months, Michael and Patricia made contact with descendants of several other people in the photograph, each one adding pieces to the larger story. Martha Williston, a great-great-granddaughter of Sarah Willis, shared letters that described how her ancestor had created a lending library in her home, circulating books throughout the mining camp and encouraging literacy long after the formal secret school had been shut down. Robert Blackwood, a great-grandson of Reverend Thomas Blackwood, provided access to additional family papers, including more diary entries and correspondence that illuminated the minister's role in supporting and protecting the secret school. Perhaps most movingly, they located descendants of Martha Owens herself. Her great-granddaughter, Carol Owens Patterson, lived in Louisville and had known Martha during the last years of her life. Carol was in her 80s now, but her memories of her great-grandmother were vivid and detailed. She was formidable, Carol said during a video interview that Michael and Patricia recorded for their research archive. Even as an old woman, she had this intensity, this sense of purpose. She talked about her time in the coal camps, about teaching miners to read by lamplight, about the satisfaction of watching adults master skills that had been denied to them. She said it was dangerous work, but it was also joyful, seeing people's faces light up when they suddenly understood how letters formed words or how to solve an arithmetic problem. Carol provided photographs of Martha from later in her life, showing a white-haired woman with keen eyes and a determined expression. She also shared a document that Martha had written in the 1920s, a memoir of sorts that described her experiences as a teacher in the coal camps. The memoir had never been published, but it provided rich detail about the secret school, the students, the methods Martha had used, and the challenges she had faced. She always kept that hymn book, Carol said, the one with the names written in it. She said it was evidence of important work, proof that ordinary people had fought for education and dignity. She wanted it preserved, wanted future generations to know what had been done. But after she died, my grandmother couldn't find it. We searched through all her possessions, but the hymn book had disappeared. We always wondered what happened to it. Michael felt a chill of recognition. The hymn book in the photograph, he said slowly. We can see the names written in it, but we've been assuming it was lost long ago. What if it still exists somewhere? What if it's in an archive or a private collection, not identified as significant because no one knew what the handwritten notations meant? The possibility opened up a new avenue of research. Michael and Patricia began contacting archives throughout Kentucky and eastern Tennessee, inquiring about hymn books or religious materials from the early 20th century that might have handwritten notations. They posted inquiries on forums devoted to genealogy and religious history, hoping that someone might recognize the description. The breakthrough came 3 months later, from the most unexpected source. A librarian at a small college in Western Virginia responded to one of their inquiries, saying that the college's special collections included a donation from a defunct Methodist church that had closed in the 1970s. Among the materials were several hymn books from the early 20th century, and one of them had extensive handwritten notations in the margins. Michael and Patricia made the drive to Virginia the following week, barely able to contain their excitement. The librarian, a young woman named Stephanie who was clearly intrigued by their research, led them to the special collections room and carefully placed a worn, leather-bound hymn book on the reading table. The cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age, but it was remarkably well preserved considering its age. Michael opened the book with trembling hands, and there, in the margins and between the printed lines of hymns, were the handwritten notations they had glimpsed in the photograph, only now they could see them in their entirety. Pages and pages of names, dates, notations about lessons completed and skills mastered. The same careful, precise handwriting that had appeared in Martha's letters, documenting the progress of dozens of students over several years. "This is it," Patricia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is Martha's record book, the documentation of the secret school. This is the actual artifact we've been seeing in the photograph." They spent the entire day photographing and documenting the hymn book, capturing every page, every notation, every detail. The librarian, understanding the significance of what they had found, agreed to keep the book in climate-controlled storage and to make it available for further research. The college president, informed of the discovery, approved a plan to digitize the entire book and create an online exhibit that would make the resource available to scholars and the general public. The hymn book contained not just names and progress notes but also occasional longer entries that functioned almost as teaching notes or reflections. Martha had written observations about individual students' learning styles, notes about which teaching methods worked best, even brief encouraging messages. "John struggles with reading but excels at arithmetic. Patient practice will build his confidence." Sarah has a gift for teaching others. Encourage her to share her knowledge. Remember, every person has the capacity to learn. Our job is to provide opportunity and encouragement. One entry, near the end of the documented period in early 1907, was particularly poignant. The company has discovered our work and we must cease temporarily. My heart breaks to turn away students who are hungry for learning. But I take comfort in knowing that the seeds we have planted will continue to grow. Knowledge, once shared, cannot be taken back. These students will pass their learning to their children, will use their literacy to demand justice, will remember that education is both a right and a tool for liberation. If my teaching has given them that understanding, then the work was worthwhile, regardless of the cost. The discovery of Martha's hymn book transformed what had started as an interesting photograph analysis into a major scholarly project with implications far beyond the immediate historical details. Michael and Patricia, working with Dr. Warren and a growing network of collaborators, began preparing a comprehensive study of secret education movements in Appalachian industrial communities, using the Lynch photograph and Martha's documentation as a central case study. The research revealed patterns that extended far beyond a single coal camp in eastern Kentucky. Throughout the industrial regions of Appalachia, teachers, ministers, and educated workers had created informal schools to provide literacy training for adults who had been denied education as children. These schools operated in the margins of society, often in direct opposition to the interests of powerful corporations that preferred an illiterate and dependent workforce. The documentation of these efforts was fragmentary and scattered, preserved in personal letters, hidden records, and occasional photographs that captured more than they appeared to show at first glance. What made the Lynch photograph and Martha's hymn book unique was the intentional nature of their documentation. Martha and Reverend Blackwood had understood that they were engaged in historically significant work, and they had deliberately created records that could survive even if they had to be hidden temporarily. The photograph, with its careful positioning of the marked hymn book, was an act of hope, a message to future generations that secret education had happened here, that people had fought for knowledge and dignity despite opposition from powerful interests. The academic publications that emerged from the research were well received, appearing in prestigious journals devoted to labor history, social movements, and Appalachian studies. But Michael and Patricia wanted the story to reach a broader audience, to be accessible not just to scholars but to ordinary people who might find inspiration in Martha's courage and the determination of her students. They worked with a documentary filmmaker to create a short film about the discovery and its significance. The film interwove the historical narrative with contemporary footage of descendants, expert commentary, and dramatic readings from Martha's letters and John Thompson's journal. It premiered at film festivals focused on social justice and historical documentary, winning awards and reaching audiences who might never have encountered the story through academic publications. Several museums and cultural centers requested permission to create exhibits based on the research. The Appalachian Heritage Museum in Asheville developed a comprehensive display that featured enlarged reproductions of the photograph, sections of the hymn book, letters and diary entries, and contemporary analysis of the social and economic context. The exhibit included interactive elements that allowed visitors to practice reading 19th-century handwriting, to understand the challenges faced by adult learners, and to reflect on contemporary parallels in educational access and social justice. Helen Thompson Martinez, inspired by her great-grandfather's story, established a scholarship fund to support adult literacy programs in Appalachian communities. Carol Owens Patterson donated Martha's personal papers to the University of Kentucky Library, ensuring that they would be preserved and accessible to future researchers. Descendants of other people in the photograph contributed family stories and materials, creating a rich archive that documented not just the secret school but the broader experience of coal mining families in early 20th century Kentucky. Perhaps most significantly, the research inspired renewed attention to contemporary educational inequities. Advocates for adult literacy programs, prison education, and educational access for marginalized communities drew connections between Martha's work and ongoing struggles to ensure that education is treated as a fundamental right rather than a privilege. The phrase that Martha had written at the top of her hymn book, "Knowledge is freedom," became something of a rallying cry for educational justice movements. 2 years after the initial discovery, Michael organized a symposium at East Tennessee State University, bringing together scholars, descendants, educators, and activists to discuss the implications of the Lynch photograph and the broader history of secret education movements. The event drew a larger crowd than anticipated, filling the university's main auditorium and requiring overflow seating in adjacent rooms with video feeds. Helen Thompson-Martinez spoke about her great-grandfather's legacy and the way that his commitment to education had been passed down through the generations, eventually inspiring her own career as a literacy teacher. Carol Owens Patterson shared her memories of Martha and read excerpts from her great-grandmother's unpublished memoir. Robert Blackwood reflected on his ancestors' role in protecting and supporting the secret school, noting that Reverend Thomas Blackwood had understood the church's obligation to stand with people facing injustice. Dr. Warren presented scholarly analysis of the social and economic context that had made secret education necessary, connecting the Lynch experience to similar movements in other industrial communities throughout the United States. She argued that understanding this history was crucial for contemporary efforts to address educational inequity, because the barriers that prevented coal miners from learning to read in 1906 had structural parallels in current systems that limited educational access for poor, incarcerated, immigrant, and other marginalized populations. But it was Michael's presentation that brought the audience to its feet in sustained applause. He showed the original photograph on the large screen, then slowly zoomed in on Martha's hymn book, revealing the handwritten names and notations that had been hidden in plain sight for more than a century. He explained the painstaking process of uncovering the story, the connections between the photograph, the diary entries, the letters, and the hymn book itself. He showed portraits of descendants who had continued Martha's legacy of fighting for educational justice. "This photograph," Michael said, standing before the huge image on the screen, "looked like a simple church portrait when it first crossed my desk. But it was actually a carefully constructed historical document, designed to preserve evidence of resistance and courage." Martha Owens and Reverend Thomas Blackwood knew they were doing important work, and they wanted to make sure it would be remembered, even if they had to hide the evidence in the margins of a hymn book and position it carefully in a photograph that wouldn't be fully understood for 100 years. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the audience. "This is what historians do. We look at the past, we pay attention to details that might seem insignificant, we ask questions about things that don't quite make sense, and sometimes, if we're lucky and persistent, we uncover stories that need to be told. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories of resistance to oppression, of courage in the face of danger, of hope that refused to die even when circumstances seemed hopeless." Michael advanced to the next slide, which showed Martha's later photograph, the one where she held the family portrait, older and confident and unbowed by the struggles she had faced. Martha Owens was not a famous person. She didn't lead armies or write groundbreaking books or hold political office. But she changed lives. She gave people tools to fight for justice. She created ripples of impact that spread forward through generations, affecting hundreds and now thousands of people who have encountered her story. That's the kind of heroism that often goes unrecognized, the quiet courage of people who do what's right even when it's dangerous, even when they receive no public acknowledgement, even when they have to hide their work in the margins of a hymn book. The symposium concluded with a panel discussion about contemporary educational justice, featuring literacy advocates, educators working with marginalized populations, and policymakers focused on expanding educational access. The connections between Martha's secret school and current struggles were clear and powerful, demonstrating that the fight for educational equity was ongoing, that the barriers faced by coal miners in 1906 had evolved but not disappeared. After the symposium ended, Michael stood in the slowly emptying auditorium, looking at the photographs still displayed on the large screen. Patricia joined him, and they stood together in comfortable silence, two colleagues who had become close friends through shared discovery and purpose. "We did good work," Patricia said simply. "Martha would be proud." Michael nodded, thinking about the chain of choices and chances that had brought this story to light. The minister who had carefully positioned a hymn book in a photograph. The photographer who had captured the image with technical precision. the family that had preserved the photograph for generations, the estate donation that had brought it to the archive, his own decision to zoom in on the hymn book pages rather than dismissing the blur as insignificant, Patricia's expertise in recognizing the signs of a literacy school, the descendants who had shared letters and journals and family memories, the librarian who had connected them to the original hymn book. Every link in that chain mattered. If any single person had made a different choice, the story might have remained hidden forever, lost in the margins of history like so many other stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. But the story had been recovered, and now it lived again, inspiring new generations to fight for educational justice, to recognize the power of knowledge, to understand that freedom requires not just political rights but also the tools to understand and claim those rights. Several months later, Michael received an unexpected email from a high school history teacher in Harlan County, Kentucky, not far from where the original Lynch Coal camp had been. The teacher explained that she had used the story of Martha Owens and the secret school as the basis for a unit on local history and social justice. Her students had been captivated by the story, and they had conducted their own research into the history of their community, interviewing older residents, exploring local archives, even tracking down descendants of people who had attended secret schools similar to Martha's. The email included photographs of the students' work, posters and presentations that connected the historical story to contemporary issues of educational access, economic justice, and community empowerment. One student had written an essay entitled, "Knowledge is Freedom, Then and Now," exploring how Martha's words still resonated in a world where education remained unevenly distributed and where literacy could determine life outcomes. The teacher's final paragraph moved Michael to tears. "Thank you for recovering this story and making it accessible. My students come from families that have been in this region for generations, and many of them are descendants of coal miners who faced the same struggles as the people in your photograph. Seeing their ancestors' courage and determination has given them a sense of pride and purpose that I've rarely seen in students. They understand now that they come from people who fought for justice, who valued education, who believed that knowledge was worth any risk. That understanding is changing how they see themselves and their possibilities." Michael forwarded the email to Patricia, to Dr. Warren, to Helen and Carol and Robert and all the others who had contributed to uncovering and sharing Martha's story. He printed out the student posters and hung them in his office, a reminder that historical research was not just about uncovering the past but about connecting that past to present and future, creating bridges across time that allowed earlier struggles to inform and inspire contemporary efforts. The photograph of the Mount Zion Methodist Church congregation, taken on a spring day in 1906 by a skilled photographer who understood that he was documenting something significant, remained the centerpiece of exhibits, publications, and educational materials. But it was no longer just a photograph. It was a portal into a world of courage and resistance, a window into the lives of people who had been marginalized by historical narratives focused on the powerful and famous, a testament to the importance of paying attention to details that might seem insignificant, of asking questions about things that don't quite add up, of persistently pursuing truth even when it requires years of research and collaboration. In the margins of Martha's hymn book, alongside the names of students and the dates of lessons completed, there was one final notation that Michael had almost missed during his initial examination. It was written in tiny script at the very bottom of the last page, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. To future readers, remember us. Remember that we fought for knowledge in difficult times. Remember that education is both a right and a weapon. Remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they act with courage and solidarity. Our shadows fall forward into your light. Make good use of what we have given you. Michael had that passage printed and framed, and it hung on his office wall beside the photograph. Whenever he started a new research project, whenever he felt discouraged by the slow pace of archival work or frustrated by gaps in documentation, he looked at those words and remembered why the work mattered. Martha and her students had fought for knowledge in difficult times, had taken risks to claim fundamental rights, had created records and documents that called forward across more than a century of time, asking to be remembered, asking their story to be told. That call had been answered. Martha's shadow, falling in an impossible direction in the photograph, reaching forward across more than 100 years, had finally found the light she had hoped for. Her story lived again, inspiring new generations to fight for educational justice, to resist systems that tried to keep people powerless through ignorance, to understand that knowledge was indeed freedom, and that the fight to ensure everyone had access to that freedom was ongoing, urgent, and worthy of any sacrifice. The restoration of the photograph was complete, but the work of bearing witness, of remembering, of connecting past struggles to present efforts, would continue as long as people were willing to look closely, ask questions, and believe that every person's story mattered, regardless of whether they appeared in history books or were hidden in the margins of a hymn book, waiting for someone to notice, to care, to bring their courage and sacrifice back into the light where it belonged.